Hey guys! Tonight, we stepped softly into the medieval world, a place where half of daily life was improvised on the spot, and the other half existed because someone forgot to undo a decision made 3 centuries earlier. Before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world, especially at these strange in-between hours. Now, dim the lights. Let the room fall into a softer shade. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum that makes everything feel a little more distant. And together, let's ease slowly into tonight's journey. The medieval town crier was never really designed to be a full-time profession. In theory, he was meant for a single task: to shout one message, one urgent announcement. Something like, "The mill is on fire," or "Please stop throwing rotten fish at the tax collector." After that, he was supposed to melt quietly back into the background the way medieval people so often did, half visible in the blur of daily life. But medieval Europe had a problem that quietly reshaped everything. Almost nobody could read. A beautifully handwritten royal decree, sealed and decorated, was essentially an ornament. The majority of the population looked at parchment with the same blank, gentle confusion that a cow might show a chessboard. It was an object full of meaning, but not for them. So, towns improvised. They looked around, found the loudest man they could, handed him a bell, and said, "Just yell everything for us." It was meant to be temporary. Simple, practical, a stopgap solution. That temporary fix, of course, became something entirely different. That is how a one-off emergency messenger turned into the medieval equivalent of a government-issued megaphone. The first time the crier walked out and made an announcement, people gathered almost automatically. Not because they were especially interested in the content, but because noise attracted medieval people the way glowing screens attract us today. Sound was a magnet. A bell, a shouted phrase. The rising pitch of urgency, these were as compelling as notifications are to us now. Once the town realized how effective this was, any serious interest in widespread literacy quietly evaporated. Efforts to teach people to read disappeared faster than a fresh loaf of bread during a famine. Why struggle through letters and ink when one man could do the work for everyone? Suddenly, the town crier became responsible for almost every piece of public information. New laws, market days, lost livestock, visiting merchants, strange weather, warnings about water. Please boil your water unless you enjoy illness. He didn't just bring news. He shattered the silence and remade it. He was the daily rhythm, the voice that framed mornings and marked emergencies. At sunrise, medieval rush hour, he would march into the marketplace, ring his bell loud enough to make infants reconsider entering the world, and shout, Hear the! In modern terms, that meant, "Attention, citizens, I am now ruining your peaceful morning for your own good." And people accepted it. They came to rely on it. He became their news feed, their voice assistant, their emergency alert system, and their neighborhood gossip network, all rolled into one sleep-deprived human being. Even when officials considered replacing him with posted notices, peasants resisted. They did not want to walk to a wooden board, squint at cramped handwriting, and try to decipher words while holding a dozen potatoes and an uncooperative chicken. So, the temporary messenger received a uniform, a salary, legal authority, and a level of job security so strong it could survive plagues, famines, and incompetent kings. In some Macedonians, families even turned the role into a small dynasty, passing the bell from one generation to the next. Imagine inheriting the family business of being professionally loud. In the end, the town crier lingered for centuries because medieval Europe quietly discovered a truth that still feels very familiar today. Why sit down to read when a man with a bell can simply yell it at you? The medieval world had another simple solution for losing things. Attach a bell to it. If livestock wandered off, you tied on a bell. If children wandered off, some parents did the same. If nobles wanted everyone to notice their presence before they even entered a room, they too reached for bells, though in their case, delicately crafted ones in silver or bronze. It all began innocently enough. Farmers put bells on cows so they wouldn't disappear into the woods and accidentally begin a new, independent life. It was a small, sensible, temporary trick, just a way to keep track of wandering beef. But medieval Europe had a very particular habit. Once something worked once, everyone copied it enthusiastically and then never questioned it again. So bells spread like a strange fashion, a practical tool turning into a cultural reflex. Soon, goats had bells. Sheep had bells. Horses had bells. One chronicler even complained in weary detail that he could not sleep because the night air jangled and jingled most annoyingly with the constant chorus of metal on movement. The countryside had, unintentionally, invented one of the earliest forms of unwanted notification spam. Then, at some point, likely a very exhausted parent, made a quiet, fateful suggestion. What if we put a bell on the toddler? With that simple thought, medieval childcare improved, at least in one sense, by a noticeable percentage. You always knew where the small, determined human was, or at least which direction the jingling was fading toward. The sound carried through doorways, around corners, through courtyards. It was reassurance disguised as noise. Of course, there was a problem. Eventually, the toddler realized the bell made sound, and then running became a game. Sprinting, spinning, dotting just to hear the little metal chime ring and rattle. Suddenly, the parents were forced into unplanned medieval interval training, chasing a giggling blur of motion and noise across yards and streets. But bells did not remain a purely practical device for long. Nobles noticed them, and once nobles noticed anything, they had a tendency to turn it into fashionable excess. They began attaching decorative bells to cloaks, boots, belts, hats, horse harnesses, and, in some cases, even sleeves. Because nothing says I am significant quite like making noise every time you move an elbow. By the late medieval period, some members of the wealthy classes had effectively transformed themselves into mobile wind chimes. Walking into a royal court could sound faintly like someone shaking a small bag of coins, or a distant, metallic flock taking flight. It may have been fashionable. It was certainly not subtle, and not especially practical. Imagine trying to sneak through a quiet corridor when you jingle like an overly dramatic house cat with an opinion of itself. Then came the jesters, who took the logic of bells to its most ridiculous and satisfying extreme. If one bell was amusing, 2 were better. If 2 were better, 27 were apparently magnificent. Every time a jester moved, turned, bowed, or leaped, a bright storm of jingling followed. Entire ecosystems of small animals likely fled the area in confusion when a heavily belled jester burst into motion. Over time, bells became so deeply woven into daily life that people forgot their origins as a temporary tracking device. They turned into tradition, into fashion, into part of the familiar soundscape of medieval towns. The chorus of bells joined shouting merchants, squawking geese, creaking carts, and somewhere, always, one person coughing ominously in a corner. Bells stayed because medieval people, like many parents and caretakers today, understood a simple, comforting truth. If something moves and makes noise, at least you know where it is. Bread in medieval Europe was never just food. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But it was also a symbol. It was political pressure, economic weather, and on bad days, an improvised blunt instrument. Bread quietly ruled everything. So when famine struck, kings and city councils scrambled to control the chaos by imposing temporary bread laws. They were designed as quick fixes, meant to stabilize prices, calm anxieties, and give the appearance that the authorities were doing something more serious than arguing about taxes and going hunting. These laws were supposed to be short-term, emergency measures. A few rules to get through a bad harvest. A little do not charge people 12 chickens for a single loaf kind of guideline. Reasonable, limited, time-bound. But medieval governments had a flaw, uncannily familiar to modern ones. Once a law existed, they rarely remembered to remove it, so the temporary bread laws remained. And remained. Slowly, they stopped feeling like emergency responses and started feeling like part of the permanent architecture of daily life. One of the most famous examples is England's assize of bread and ale. It began as a response to food shortages, a rule intended to ensure that bakers could not overcharge underweight, or otherwise exploit desperate customers. On paper, it was sensible, humane, and temporary. Then the authorities effectively said, "Actually, let's keep this indefinitely." That quirky law about bread in Britain, it's one of those wild stories that just keeps going. Right? Imagine this. A temporary rule that stuck around for over 6 centuries. It outlasted kings, bakers who grumbled about it, and even peasants who just pretended to understand it when it got too inconvenient. It's kind of hilarious when you think about it. This law was so detailed that it turned into a bit of a comedy show. Picture this. It didn't just say how big a loaf had to be. It got into the nitty-gritty of weight, price, and even what ingredients could be used. And get this, it even had rules for ale merchants. Yep, there were limits on how tipsy they could get while selling their wares. The answer? Not very. If a baker dared to sell a loaf that was even a smidge too small, they could face fines, public shaming, or worse. Talk about a medieval version of bad reviews, right? Forget about burning down a village. That might have been negotiable. But selling underweight bread, that was like asking for trouble on a silver platter. There were actual bread inspectors, yes, real people with real jobs who went around checking loaves, like stern medieval personal trainers, making sure no one was cheating on their diet. They were the state's way of standing between the hungry public and the temptation to shave off a few ounces for a quick profit. Eventually, the famine ended, and harvests got better. But those bread laws, they stuck around like that overprotective grandmother who won't leave the kitchen, even when everything's under control. People accepted it, partly because tradition often feels heavier than logic, and partly because everyone remembered the chaos that bread riots could unleash. An angry crowd armed with nothing but stale loaves and hunger. That's a sight to fear. So, what started as a temporary regulation to keep the peace morphed into one of Europe's most micromanaging laws. And why? Because no one bothered to ask, do we still need this? Now, let's chat about straw on tavern floors. It's another little nugget of medieval life that turned into a lasting tradition. At some point, an innkeeper got a bright idea before a big feast or festival. They scattered clean straw across the floor to soak up spilled ale, muffle the sound of footsteps, and even hide some unpleasant smells. Plus, it added a rustic charm. Right. Guests seemed to dig it. Or maybe they were just too tipsy to care. The night rolled on, with ale flowing, laughter echoing, and spills happening that nobody would remember the next day. The morning after, the innkeeper took a look around. The tables, the benches, and that dim light filtering through the windows all looked fine. But underfoot, that straw had done its job like a quiet miracle. It soaked up the ale, the mud, the remnants of food, and all those mysterious puddles no one wanted to investigate too closely. All the innkeeper had to do was rake it up, toss it out, and bring in fresh straw. Easy peasy, right? But here's the kicker. Medieval innkeepers were, well, medieval. When something worked once, they treated it like it was blessed by the heavens. If straw made cleaning easy one night, why not do it every night? And just like that, a simple, practical idea turned into a custom, a habit, and eventually an expectation. What started as a clever hack morphed into a staple of tavern life. In each of these stories, the town crier ringing his bell, the bells tied to animals, the relentless bread laws, and the straw underfoot, we see a familiar pattern. In the medieval world, temporary solutions had a sneaky way of becoming permanent features. A quick fix turned into a profession. A small bell became a trend, and a short-term law became the rule for centuries. That single scattering of straw, it became a lasting part of tavern culture. And as we reflect on these echoes from the past, it's hard not to notice how similar this pattern is to our lives today. The things we whip up to solve a problem for a night, a season, or a crisis have a way of sticking around. They settle into the background, transforming into the norm. So, as you kick back and imagine those quiet corners of the medieval world, picture this. A dark street at dawn, a man with a bell lifting his voice, a cow somewhere in the distance softly chiming, a baker meticulously weighing dough, and a tavern floor cushioned with straw, muffling the footsteps of the last patrons as they stumble out. And above it all, that same human habit stretches from their world to ours. Inventing something for a moment, and then, through simple forgetfulness and comfort, keeping it for a lifetime. It's fascinating, isn't it? How we all carry a little piece of that medieval spirit with us, whether we realize it or not. Why not keep the floors permanently covered in something visitors could not easily see through, smell through, or judge too harshly? And so, what began as a temporary decoration quietly transformed into a lifestyle choice. Before long, travelers expected taverns to have straw underfoot. If you stepped into a medieval inn and saw bare wooden boards, something felt immediately deeply wrong. Either you had wandered into a noble establishment where people frowned upon fun and spontaneity, or the place had been recently robbed, and the straw stolen to stuff beds or fuel fires. Straw became part of the tavern's identity, as essential as the bar itself. The ale, the crackle of conversation, and at least one man in the corner who absolutely insisted he was not sleeping, only resting his eyes. Over time, the layer of straw thickened. New straw was scattered over old straw, more ale was spilled, more boots tracked in mud, and worse, more arguments ended with tankards tipped over, drinks soaking quietly into the floor. Eventually, the tavern floor developed layers like a small archaeological site. Each stratum told the story of some previous evening's questionable decisions. If you could peel it back, you could read the history of laughter, brawls, toasts, heartbreak, and songs sung out of tune. The smell did not exactly improve, but medieval people were seasoned professionals at ignoring smells. Their homes often carried the scent of smoke, livestock, sweat, damp clothing, and occasionally something that felt a lot like despair. Compared to that, a bit of tavern straw odor hardly registered on their internal scale of concern. Even in later centuries, when early forms of health inspections began to appear, officials complained that tavern straw harbored fleas, spilled ale, old food, and several life decisions no broom could ever truly erase. But by then, it was far too late. Straw floors had become tradition, and you do not casually argue with tradition, especially not while standing ankle-deep in it. So, what started as a one-night aesthetic experiment became a habit that lingered across regions and centuries. All because, on one busy evening, an overworked innkeeper said, "Just throw some straw on it," and no one ever seriously suggested stopping. Castle kitchens, at least in theory, were supposed to be carefully designed. The kitchen was one of the most dangerous rooms in any fortress. Open flames, boiling cauldrons, heavy pots dangling from hooks, sharp knives wielded by cooks who had been awake since before dawn, quietly plotting revenge against anyone who dared bring them under-seasoned meat. You might expect castle architects to plan these spaces with meticulous care, but medieval reality was flexible, chaotic, and full of sudden emergencies. Many castle kitchens did not begin with a blueprint. They began with a crisis. Perhaps the original kitchen burned down, which medieval kitchens were disturbingly good at doing. Perhaps the castle was under siege, and the residents needed somewhere, anywhere, to cook that was not currently on fire or under attack. Perhaps the Lord decided he wanted a grander hall for feasting and politics, and the existing kitchen was rudely shoved aside like a stool no one wanted to trip over. Whatever the reason, temporary kitchens began popping up in the oddest corners. A hallway, that would do. A spare chamber no one was using that week. Fine. A room directly adjacent to the latrines. Disastrous, obviously, yet somehow chosen again and again. The logic, every time, was simple. We will fix this later. But later never truly arrived. Once a makeshift kitchen started functioning, castle life simply adapted around it. Servants memorized new, awkward routes. Fire wardens prayed with quiet intensity. Architects pretended they had not seen the latest relocation. Cooks learned to navigate strange layouts that violated almost every basic rule of safety and comfort. In some castles, the temporary kitchen ended up very far from the dining hall. Servants had to carry heavy trays of boiling stew and fragile pastries across open courtyards, down narrow staircases, around corners, past defensive structures and lounging guards, and often through the path of wandering livestock. It became a medieval obstacle course performed while balancing dinner. One misstep, and the evening feast vanished into the mud, along with a servant's pride and, occasionally, several layers of skin. A single accident could mean cancelled dinner and months of painful recovery. Other temporary kitchens had ceilings so low that tall cooks spent their working lives slightly hunched, giving later observers the impression that medieval kitchen workers were somehow a separate, stooped subspecies of humanity. Some kitchens lacked proper chimneys, so smoke simply filled whatever room had been sacrificed, turning meal preparation into a daily endurance test of stinging eyes, coughing fits, and soot-stained lungs. The strangest improvisations were the kitchens squeezed into gatehouses or positioned right next to the castle's main entrance. Few greetings are as memorable as entering a grand fortress and being welcomed first by the smell of roasting meat and the sharp, echoing language of overworked cooks who had already had a very long day. Despite the chaos, people adjusted. Castle life flowed around these improvised kitchen placements until they no longer felt temporary at all. The emergency solution hardened into long-term architecture, and that, in many ways, is the medieval pattern. If it works today, then it is somehow good enough for the next 200 years. Medieval rulers had a particular fondness for temporary laws. They produced them the way modern people send text messages, frequently, impulsively, and without dwelling too long on the consequences. A king might wake up, hear that someone's goats had escaped, and caused chaos in the market one too many times, and, in a fit of frustration, dictate a new decree. This, he would announce, shall stand only until the crisis ends. But in medieval Europe, crises had a stubborn way of never fully ending. So the laws stayed. Imagine a bishop complaining that Sunday markets were too loud, disturbing his sermons. In response, a temporary ban might be issued. No selling fish on Sundays within earshot of the church. In theory, that rule should last a week or two, perhaps a season at most. Instead, it quietly transformed into a regional custom, then a regional law, then a long-lived expectation that outlasted the very church building that sparked it. Or think of a rule forbidding citizens from walking around the castle at night unless they carried a lantern and were accompanied by at least one sober adult. It might have been introduced during a brief surge of nighttime crime or accidents. Then the surge passed. The law did not. Centuries later, people reading old records wondered if the medieval night air had once been uniquely dangerous, or if the darkness itself had been thought to behave in oddly aggressive ways. The core problem was simple. Medieval Europe lacked a delete button. Once a law was written down, it joined the ever-growing family of decrees, proclamations, and regulations squeezed into the margins of parchment scrolls. No one wanted to be the official responsible for abolishing an older law. What if it turned out to be important? What if some distant saint or long-dead king had cared deeply about it? What if ending it introduced chaos? Or worse, created extra paperwork? As time passed, these temporary laws piled up into layers of legal clutter. Historians today, digging through old archives, still stumble across rules that read like very specific, very odd reactions to long-forgotten incidents. No pigs may enter the marketplace unless wearing a control rope. Citizens shall not throw snowballs at soldiers. The fact that such laws existed at all is both amusing and faintly alarming. Something must have happened. Someone must have tried, probably more than once. Many of these rules became so outdated that people forgot the stories behind them. Villagers kept following them simply because that is how things had always been done. If a young person ever questioned why, elders responded with the medieval equivalent of, "Don't ask questions." This is tradition. On rare occasions, medieval rulers did attempt to tidy up the mess. They issued new temporary laws designed to amend, suspend, or clarify the old temporary laws. But these corrections, too, had a habit of becoming permanent. Legal reform turned into an endless cycle, like trying to put out a fire by throwing more parchment onto the flames. In the end, medieval Europe did not just inherit grand traditions, old songs, and sacred festivals. It also inherited centuries of hastily improvised rules that refused to die. A temporary decree might vanish in a season, or it might quietly haunt society until the Renaissance. You never quite knew which one you were dealing with. The castle moat, that classic symbol of medieval power and dramatic stone architecture, began in a surprisingly humble way. It was not always part of an elegant master plan. Most moats started life as simple ditches, dug in a hurry when danger loomed. Picture a worried noble pacing his courtyard, watching enemy banners on the horizon, and barking in anxious order. Dig something, anything. Just make it harder for them to walk straight at us with knives and ladders. So peasants grabbed shovels, and in their exhausted labor, they unintentionally shaped Europe's future postcard scenery. These early ditches were meant to slow attackers, disrupt their footing, and tangle siege equipment. They were not intended to become permanent, picturesque water features. Many of them did not even contain water at first. They were, in essence, glorified trenches. But, true to form, medieval Europe excelled at turning accidents into tradition. Once the ditch was there, lords began to ask a different question. The hole already exists, they thought. What if we keep it? Then, at some point, someone had a quietly transformative idea. What if we fill it with water? This was followed, naturally, by a practical concern. Where will we get the water? Imagine this. A casual conversation among medieval lords, and someone, probably with a shrug and a mischievous grin, suggests, why not just borrow some water from the river? Divert it, steal it, if we have to. And just like that, the water-filled moat was born, an idea sparked by a mix of improvisation, a dash of desperation, and a sprinkle of cheeky hydrological theft. Once what was just a ditch transformed into a genuine moat, the whole vibe of the castle shifted. Suddenly, visitors gazed upon a shimmering ring of water surrounding the walls, and thought, wow, this lord means business. He's got a moat. The cleanliness of that water. Who cares? It was often murky and stagnant, home to a whole ecosystem of critters. What really mattered was the impression it left. Distance, danger, and difficulty. To the medieval folks, that moats screamed authority. But let's be real, moats came with their own set of quirky challenges. Mosquitoes loved them, turning the area into a buzzing paradise. Frogs moved in and started their nightly croaking concerts, which might have been charming if you weren't trying to sleep. And then there were those poor servants, chasing after laundry that decided to take a swim, slipping and sliding in the mud. It was a messy business. Every now and then, some brave soul would attempt to wade across, only to find out that mud has zero respect for human dignity. Despite all the chaos, those moats did their job. They discouraged casual attackers, slowed down siege towers, and made any approach to a castle feel like a daunting challenge, more like a test from someone who had a serious grudge. So, moats stuck around. Even as the original threats faded, borders changed, and warfare evolved. Those water rings remained. When cannons came into play and the high stone walls started to lose their edge, some lords began to rethink their moats. A few drained the water and transformed them into fancy gardens, exotic animal enclosures, or awkward walking paths that made visitors feel like they were stuck in a maze. But surprisingly, very few opted to fill them in completely. The shape of the moat stayed etched into the landscape. By then, the moat had evolved from just a simple ditch. It became part of the castle's identity, a lasting reminder of that classic medieval pattern. What started as a quick fix in a moment of crisis quietly morphed into a permanent feature of the world's design, blending history with a touch of whimsy. ISNT. It's fascinating how something born out of necessity can become a symbol of strength and resilience. A temporary ditch, dug in a quiet moment of panic, slowly evolved into one of the most enduring symbols of medieval defense. All because, long ago, one noble paced his walls and murmured, "Just dig a hole." And everyone who followed decided that the hole, in its stark simplicity, held a certain quiet beauty. In the medieval world, taverns served as the gentle thread weaving communities together. They were the gathering place for stories, the quiet confessional for weary hearts, the stage for laughter and song, and sometimes the foggy morning puzzle, where you wondered whose boots now cradled your feet. Because taverns stood at the heart of social life, they quietly gave birth to a familiar custom, the tab. But these medieval tabs were never intended to stretch across seasons or years. The idea unfolded simply. You had forgotten your coins at home, or the night felt too long to stumble back for them, so you turned to the tavern keeper and said, "Put it on my account." It was a harmless understanding, temporary, warmly trusting, meant to be settled by week's end. When the harvest coin or market wage arrived, yet medieval people mirrored us in their quiet resolve against restraint. Much like gazing at a soft, waiting cheesecake on a late evening, the tab began to grow, almost without notice. First, a few measures of ale to ease the day's weight, then a simple supper of bread and stew, then another ale, because someone's offhand remark about your stew had stung just enough. Before long, a round for the table, to honor a tale that suddenly seemed worth toasting. Soon, the sum loomed so large that settling it called for a miracle harvest, or some divine favor whispered in the fields. The tavern keeper, of course, noted every detail with the steady hand of a scribe. While much of medieval accounting rested on hopeful memory and loose tallies, tavern ledgers stood firm as ancient oaks. He might overlook whose sheep grazed the common green, but he never forgot your 11 ales, 3 full meals, and that one stool splintered in the heat of last Thursday's debate. When a patron passed stand in medieval times, such departures came with gentle frequency. The keeper simply shifted the tab to the heirs. Inheritance carried no mercy. Land flowed to the next generation. Debts followed suit. And yes, the tavern tab trailed behind like a faithful shadow. Picture receiving your rich uncle's modest estate, only to find the tavern keeper at the door, ledger in end. I was not even a thought in the world when he savored that soup, you might whisper. Yet there it stood, etched in ink. Some families bore these tavern debts like heirlooms, wrapped in quiet legend. A young man, stepping into manhood, might declare his freedom at last. Then the keeper would appear, patient as dusk, and murmur, "Not quite. You carry 6 gallons of ale. Your grandfather drank through the lean famine of 1321. Over time, tabs wove so deeply into village life that they became an unspoken credit among neighbors. People bartered futures against them, haggled softly over tallies, even boasted of their standing in hushed tones. In the most storied hamlets, a tab might rival the mortgage of a modest tower. In the end, the medieval tab endured because it soothed a universal ache. The pull of ale in the moment, responsibility deferred to tomorrow's light. What began as a fleeting kindness bloomed into a generational custom, born of thirst and tended by the slow art of postponement. Winters in the medieval countryside demanded a patient ingenuity, a steady resolve, and now and then the grace to welcome a chicken into the hearth's glow. The practice started with clear purpose. As the coldest months descended, windfrost, bit deeper than any lord's indifference presents, guided their hens indoors, just for the season, to shield them from the killing chill. A living hen offered eggs through the dark months. A frozen one brought only sorrow. This was to last 3 moons of winter, then gently part ways. Birds to cobe, humans to their hearths. But medieval folk soon uncovered a hidden warmth in the arrangement. Chickens inside meant eggs close at hand. No more venturing into swirling snow to coax a gift from a reluctant hen. Now she perched by the fire like a feathered companion, absorbing the glow, watching the family with that steady, knowing gaze. Before long, hens claimed their corners of the cottage. They nudged straw into nests, paced with the quiet assurance of creatures vital to the roof overhead. Peasants welcomed this. Their homes already mingled smoke, tools, children's laughter, and the faint earthiness of larger beasts. 1 or 3 hens blended seamlessly into the rhythm. The shift came with spring's thaw, when the birds showed no haste to depart, accustomed to shelter, companionship, and the scatter of hearthside crumbs. Why trade warmth for the wind-whipped coop? Peasants paused, then their winter guests had become steadfast dwellers. Cottage days reshaped around them. Feet moved with care over dozing forms. Meals paused to shoo a hen from the board, with the same soft patience spared for wandering young ones. Talks wove through bursts of cluck and flutter, each home harboring that one hen who ruled with unspoken command. Chickens joined the cottage symphony. The hearth's low crackle, voices murmuring through evening. The sudden, proud cackle of a fresh egg laid. Visitors scarcely blinked. Their own hearths echoed the same gentle disorder. If anything, an indoor hen signaled thriving, a life preserved against the frost. Through generations, the custom settled like dust in sunlight. A desperate winter measure softened into a lively tradition. Cottages turned micro-farms. hens silent kinfolk. Medieval souls did not merely endure the shared space. They found a peculiar harmony in it, and the chickens, in their way, seemed content as well. In the early medieval haze, most folk needed no family names, hamlets huddled small, journeys rare, scandals the surest map to identity. Say John, and all knew, the one usually tied to some fresh tale of mishap or mirth. But as numbers swelled, a quiet tangle emerged. Too many Johns roamed the lanes. The answer arrived lightly. Passing nicknames, mere whispers to mark one from another. John the baker, whose loaves steamed golden. Jon Tital, who brushed low beams. John the quiet, ever at the edge. John of the faint fish scent, from days by the stream. These were breezes, not anchors casual, shifting for a season or a lifetime, never carved eternal. Then bureaucracy stirred, patient and unyielding. As taxes, lands, quarrels filled the scribes' rolls, identifiers became needful. No room for John by the well, but not too near. After that business, so they borrowed the village whisper, inked it firm. Once set in parchment, the name hardened, official. Then, inevitably, passed to kin. Thus, age's own, families bear echoes, short, long, Armstrong, swift, brown from earth-stained hands, cook from the fire's watch, fisher from river holes, baker from dawn ovens, fleeting shouts across mire, now woven into bloodlines, some nicknamed graced like sunlight. Many did not. Envision John the Bald, shorn by winter ague, his line forever Mr. Bald, through centuries of full heads. Or William Crooked Nose, whose folk wished the scribe a holiday that fateful day. Others hint at quirks. Folks for the communal sort, stout for unyielding frame, pepper for sharp tongue, fox for sly glances, goodman for steady heart. Traits, jests, stumbles, long faded, yet clinging like mist. The purest whimsy freezes a breath. A mud slip, a goat chase, a scorched loaf. That instant brand's descendants. Not mere name, but fate's wry sketch. By late medieval days, surnames stood immutable. Ephemeral tags bloomed into legacies. The world took a lane-side laugh and forged it into lineage. Perhaps the most purely medieval act of all. Medieval Europe crafted no grand road web. Such visions demand forethought, counsels, sketches, voices urging caution. Roads arose otherwise, enough souls treading one soft field until a furrow formed, and all nodded in unison. Here lies the way. These paths began humbly, as fleeting cuts through the land. Harvest folk veering swift to fields, shepherds curving round flooded vales, merchants dodging the wolf-haunted trail. Improvised, chance born wholly unfit for enduring tread. Yet medieval habit held firm. What served once, served always. Permanence through unhurried use. Hamlets embraced the ruts as arteries. No stones laid smooth, no gravel bound, no hand to level the tilt. Merely earth gouged by patient feet, hoof falls, cart groans, and now and then a goose adrift in purpose. Rain was the quiet enemy of medieval travel. A brief, pleasant drizzle could soften a dirt track into a shallow swamp. A proper storm could transform it into something thick and yielding, closer to bread dough than solid earth. Carts sank and groaned where they stood. Horses plunged ankle-deep, sometimes worse. People lost shoes so often that retrieving abandoned footwear from the muck became a kind of neighborhood pastime. Chroniclers of the age described roads as deep, treacherous, and impossible, which were very polite ways of advising, do not attempt this unless you enjoy suffering. And still, no one truly fixed them. To maintain a road meant work. Work demanded planning. Planning required someone to take charge. Medieval villages, skilled at survival, were equally talented at sidestepping all three. The crown occasionally issued grand declarations. Henceforth, all towns shall repair their roads. Towns, hearing this, smiled the slow, unreadable smile of people who had no intention of changing their ways. Over the years, the muddy tracks hardened into habit. Maps recorded them. Merchants depended on them. Armies marched through them, one squelching step at a time. The memory that these were meant as temporary shortcuts faded like footprints after rain. Travelers began describing journeys in almost spiritual terms, as if trudging along the road were a form of penance. When modern scholars read these accounts, filled with piety and despair, they can translate them into something much simpler. I never want to see mud again. By the time proper paving slowly began to appear in later centuries, some paths had been muddied for so long that people treated the mud almost like an inheritance. It had a story, a reputation, an attitude. It was not just mud. It was their mud. A path carved as a temporary shortcut had become a medieval highway, and every traveler who dragged a boot through it paid for that decision. Medieval battles, when seen from a distance, might have looked like storms of metal and dust. Up close, they were chaotic, deafening, and thick with confusion. Men wore helmets that hid their faces, armor that disguised their shapes, and insignia that blurred beneath grime and blood. In the crush and roar of combat, telling friend from foe was a genuine challenge. Commanders needed something simple, something that could cut through the chaos without requiring literacy or calm reflection. So they came up with a temporary answer. A flag, a bright banner, visible above the clash of spears and swords, fluttering in the wind. Its meaning was straightforward. If you stand under this cloth, the men around you are your side. Do not stab them. That was all it was meant to be. A practical marker, a medieval version of a team jersey, only taller and far more likely to be but temporary solutions in this world never stayed modest. If a banner survived a battle through luck, skill, or sheer happenstance, it became an object of affection. Soldiers began to see it as a lucky charm. Commanders insisted on bringing the same banner to the next fight and the next. Over time, the cloth, once mundane, grew into something quieter and deeper, an emotional anchor. If that flag fell, or worse, was captured or lost, chroniclers wrote about it as if the sky itself had cracked. The loss of a banner was mourned in language normally reserved for floods and plagues. It was like losing an honored elder if that elder were made of linen and had never done anything at family gatherings except be present. Then came the embellishment. Nobles began decorating their flags with beasts, motifs, colors, and intricate designs. These symbols were meant to stir courage and loyalty. The fact that many infantrymen could not read the words, and others lived in a world of faded dyes and poor eyesight, did not deter them. The banners still grew more elaborate, painted and stitched until they were works of art. They became too precious for war and yet war is precisely where they were always taken. Some banners gained reputations bordering on myth. A scrap of cloth that had survived 2 wars, 3 sieges, and 1 memorable storm would be spoken of. In reverent tones, people began to whisper that it enjoyed divine favor. "This banner cannot fall," they cried, as if the fabric had acquired its own invisible armor. With each narrow escape, its story swelled, like the pride of the people following it. Slowly, the battlefield flags crept beyond their original purpose. They no longer just marked where to stand and whom not to stab. They evolved into symbols of kingdoms, peoples, and entire cultures. A piece of cloth that had begun as a practical marker became a mirror in which a community saw itself. Centuries later, people gaze at national flags with solemnity, tracing supposed layers of meaning in every color and stripe. Philosophies are read into them, identities tied around them. But at their distant origins, most started for one humble reason. Someone needed a tall, visible signpost to show soldiers where not to swing their swords. A temporary battlefield hack, born in dust and confusion, quietly grew into the logo of civilization. Feast days in medieval Europe began as rare bursts of color in a gray, demanding world. At first, they were special occasions. A day to honor a saint, remember a miracle, or simply pull a village back from the edge of winter gloom. These celebrations were meant to be scattered across the year, like lanterns brief, bright, and rare. Life was hard. Plumbing was a dream yet to be dreamt. Bread counted as mild excitement. A feast day brought singing, food, ale, and a brief release from the grind. It was meant to be temporary, occasional, a treat. Then people noticed a small but powerful truth. Feast days were much more pleasant than work days. The first time a village hosted a feast that went well, that is, the music held, the tables stayed mostly upright. The food was good, and the fights were minor. And easily forgiven, everyone agreed. We must do this again. Word traveled as it always did. Nearby villagers heard of the celebration, and, with a mixture of envy and curiosity, asked, "Why don't we have a feast like that?" The church, meanwhile, cherished saints the way collectors cherished rare coins. Each saint offered another reason for a feast, and official approval often followed. Gradually, the calendar filled. What had been a few holy days blossomed into a dense collection. Feasts for saints' births and deaths, for miracles, for relics, for local legends. Feast days for the saint who, it was said, drove out a plague. Feast days for the one who stopped a cow from bolting. Somewhere, a village celebrated a man remembered only for doing something admirable involving bread, though the story itself slipped away with time. On parchment, peasants were expected to labor through most of the year. In practice, in some regions, a startling portion of days vanished into feasts, half-feasts, fasts, pre-feasts, and lingering celebrations afterwards. A person might rise at dawn ready to harvest or mend, only to be informed it was Saint So-and-so's day, and therefore a moral obligation to attend, drink, and socialize instead. Officials complained. Some kings attempted to curtail the flood of holidays in the name of productivity. Yet when the feasts arrived, those same kings appeared at the head table, toasting with the rest. Priests preached moderation one day and presided over lavish celebrations the next. The hypocrisy became part of the charm, woven into the music and the clatter of cups. By the later Middle Ages, Europe was saturated with feast days. No one could clearly recall which had been meant as a one-time lift of the spirit and which were ancient obligations. A single celebration meant to raise a village's mood had multiplied into a long series of reasons to lay down tools, and medieval people, in their own brilliant, chaotic way, embraced this wholeheartedly. If life offered a choice between toil and sanctioned revelry, they knew where wisdom lay. Medieval hairstyles, like so many things from that age, were not known for moderation. They often began with a mistake, a joke, or an impulsive choice, then spread until they seemed inevitable. Some of the most memorable styles we see in manuscripts and carvings originated as something temporary. Take the monk's tonsure, the shaved circle on top of the head, leaving a ring of hair like a solemn crown. Officially, it symbolized humility, a renunciation of worldly vanity. Unofficially, it may well have started with a botched haircut. Perhaps a razor slipped while trimming a weary brother's hair. Panic followed. Then someone, thinking quickly, declared, "It is a sign of holiness." Instead of fixing it, monasteries adopted it. Generations of monks walked the earth with a look that made them appear permanently surprised. Then there were the shaved foreheads of fashionable noble women. This style was meant to lengthen the face, giving the illusion of a grand high forehead, an ideal of beauty at the time. It's pretty wild to think about how a simple haircut can spark a whole fashion revolution, right? Imagine it starting as just a quick fix for a bad hair day, or maybe even a one-off experiment. But before anyone knew it, this quirky trend took off like wildfire. Women all over were suddenly plucking and shaving the front of their hairlines, chasing that smooth, wide forehead look. For over a century, they strutted around under candlelight, their foreheads shining bright like living fashion beacons. Can you picture that? And then there's the whole power play with hairstyles. Picture a duke stepping into a fancy court, rocking an outrageous do like two little horn-like tufts, or hair sculpted into a towering point. It's hard not to chuckle. Right. But this duke, oh boy, he's convinced it's the epitome of He's got the authority, so everyone else scrambles to mimic him. Within no time the nobility is parading around, looking like they've just stepped out of a whimsical art piece. All thanks to a bit of mischief and a whole lot of influence. But wait, there's more. Some hairstyles weren't just born out of fashion, but from the chaos of war. Imagine a knight coming back from battle, pulling off his helmet to reveal hair that's all twisted and wild, like he just had a tussle with the wind. Instead of being embarrassed, he plays it cool, claiming it's a bold style choice. His buddies see him owning it and think, why not? Soon, They're all rocking that same look, as if they've just survived a storm together. It's kind of funny how confidence can turn a messy look into a trend. What's really fascinating is how these styles didn't just fade away. Once a hairstyle caught on, no matter how silly it might have seemed at first, it became part of everyday life. Artists painted it, scribes illustrated it in their margins, and poets even referenced it in their verses. Kids grew up thinking, this is how the important people look. What started as a weekend laugh somehow turned into decades of tradition. It's like medieval society had this amazing knack for turning accidents into lasting customs. They just wouldn't collectively say, hey, this looks ridiculous. Let's stop so. Just like roads, laws, feasts, and even moats. What began as a fleeting decision at the mirror became woven into the fabric of life, meant for a moment, yet sticking around for ages. Isn't that just the craziest thing? In a world without mirrors to betray the truth, a single bad hair day could quietly bloom into an entire culture. Cities in the Middle Ages did not rise from careful blueprints or grand visions. They grew because people arrived, raised something simple for the moment, and then lingered, allowing time to weave it into permanence. What began as a scattering of seasonal hut sasali, thrown together by traveling workers, merchants, or harvest hands, slowly took root. These were meant as fleeting shelters, lean-tos of wood and thatch, tents of worn canvas, anything that held against the wind and offered a dry corner for sleep. It always unfolded in the same gentle rhythm. A band of laborers arrived to mend a castle wall, reap a vast field, or lay stones for a church that would span lifetimes. They needed rest, so they built small, sturdy enough for weeks. Then dismantle and depart. But dismantling rarely happened. Perhaps the work stretched longer than hoped. Perhaps the rain turned relentless, and the hut felt unexpectedly secure. Perhaps fatigue whispered that home was too far. Whatever the quiet reason, medieval workers did what came naturally. They paused, then stayed. More souls followed. Merchants sensed opportunity, setting stalls to sell bread, ale, tools to the toiling men. Their own shelters joined the cluster. Families trailed the laborers, raising homes a touch more solid. Then came the blacksmith, ever shadowing work like a faithful companion. Forge in tow, before long, the temporary camp bore the faint outline of a village. Smoke rose from multiple hearths. Voices mingled at dusk. Paths formed between doorways. At some point the local lord would pass by, note the unauthorized gathering of roofs, and declare with satisfaction, a fine new quarter. Rent begins at once. With those words, the fragile structures gained quiet legitimacy. Timber replaced flimsy frames. Paths widened into lanes. A well sank deep into the earth. Inevitably, a tavern appeared because no medieval cluster endured without one, drawing folk with its glow and murmur. Generations passed before anyone paused to reflect. Families now traced roots to those first huts. Some of Europe's storied districts began precisely so. Unplanned suburbs, born of weary travelers who chose rest over return. Modern eyes trace the serpentine streets of medieval towns and wonder at their twist. The paths curved without reason, alleys narrow abruptly. The truth lies simple. They were never planned streets. They were the gaps between two huts that outlasted their welcome by 8 quiet centuries. Temporary shelters in Tatwar did not vanish with the season. They softened into homes, then streets, then the living pulse of cities. Mary Tudor entered the world on a cold February morning in 1516, the long-awaited child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She was not the son her father had prayed for through endless vigils, but she arrived, healthy, bright-eyed, and with a spark of intelligence that caught even ambassadors off guard. They wrote of her with the wonder reserved for rare gifts. She mastered Latin before most noble children grasped their forks. Her fingers danced over the virginals with a grace beyond her years. She carried herself with a calm dignity that stilled rooms, drawing adults into unconscious poise. For a fleeting season, she knew the warmth of a cherished princess. The court embraced the Tudor heir, daughter or not, for she was Henry's blood. Those early years rested on sands destined to shift. Mary revered her mother, a woman of unyielding faith and quiet steel, who instilled in her a deep sense of duty and devotion that would echo through her life. She adored her father, too, who doted openly at first, lifting her high for dignitaries to admire, as if she embodied heaven's favor. Little Mary could not know that the same hands would one day cast her down, demanding she deny her mother's union. As she grew, so did Henry's shadow of doubt over a missing son. Catherine's hopes ended in stillbirths and grief, and Henry, aberraced of fate as indifference, sought theological paths around it. Eyes turning to an abut, the court thickened with whispers of a Mary, old enough to sense the chill, watched her world fracture, her mother exiled, forbidden even a daughter's touch, and ascending in her place. In those halls, love proved fragile, a king's favor, a fleeting light. By adolescence, the celebrated princess had become a quiet burden, torn between maternal loyalty and paternal storm. She endured, but the scars lingered, shaping her piety, her caution, the queen she would forge from pain. Mary Tudor's descent from grace unfolded not in thunder, but in a slow, relentless erosion, each humiliation carving deeper. When Henry severed from Rome to claim Bullen, Mary became the unintended cost of his remaking. A proclamation stripped her. No longer princess, but plain Lady Mary, a title honed to wound, marking her as bastard in her father's eyes. The court, once deferential, offered cool courtesy, as if she lingered only in memory. Worse came the exile from Catherine, her sole harbor. Henry and Anne. New separation cut deeper than iron bars. Letters passed in secret, fragile threads of love and resolve. Catherine urged her to affirm the true queen, Mary held fastifying father and stepmother alike, and saw in Mary a living challenge, emblem of a marriage that refused oblivion. Mary's survival mocked Elizabeth's cradle claim. Whispers held and wished her gone gossip or venom, the fear rooted deep. The women orbited in wary silence, prisoners of politics. Then, in 1536, the blow Mary dreaded. Catherine's death, alone, frail, faith unbroken. Grief swallowed Mary, laced with guilt for distance unbridged, nous finaux imbrassi. Her anchor gone, the world narrowed to echoes. Anne's own fall followed swiftly, her tower end a spectacle. Mary felt no joy, only hollow release. Factions pressed reconciliation. Sign away legitimacy. Void your parents' vows. Cruel salvation through surrender. She signed not from belief, but the raw math of survival. Mary Tudor, annealed by sorrow, chose breath over pride. Within dust and Jane Seymour rising, gentle light pierced Mary's walls. Jane, unlike her predecessor, held true compassion, weaving bridges with tact and heart. Charles V's envoys nudged relentlessly. Mary returned to court, on his terms, after the bitter oath. Henry welcomed with familiar warmth, as if years dissolved like mist. He demanded forgetfulness, instant and absolute. Mary smiled, obeyed, resumed the dutiful daughter. Yet within, wounds festered, abandonment, shame, the ghost of betrayed vows. Jane eased her path, treating her not as riddle or relic, but woman weathered by storms. Mary cherished her above all wives, tasting family's fragile bloom. For a breath, peace held, hearth-soft, in the Tudor gale. Mary also poured her affection into the child Jane Seymour brought into the world, the future Edward VI. Holding her baby brother, Mary allowed herself a rare, fragile hope. Perhaps their newly mended family might finally endure. Perhaps the storms had passed. But stability at the Tudor court was a mirage that never held for long. Jane Seymour died days after giving birth, leaving Mary bereaved once more, her brief taste of familial harmony cut short. Henry married again, and again, and again. Each new queen meant a new atmosphere, a new balance of danger, an opportunity for Mary to decipher. And of Cleves proved harmless, more a political arrangement than a rival. Catherine Howard was dangerously impulsive, her recklessness setting the court on edge. Catherine Parr was intelligent and kind, someone Mary could almost trust. Yet she stood deeply entwined in Protestant reform, something Mary regarded with quiet horror, though officially restored to grace. Mary moved as if the floor beneath her might shift at any moment. Her Catholic faith remained immovable, the one certainty she would not compromise. Henry's religious policies, however, swayed with politics and mood. Each turn of doctrine threatened her standing. She outwardly obeyed, but her inner convictions never wavered. She lived in a state of cautious acceptance, tolerated, not truly trusted. Welcomed in ceremony, watched in private. Deep down, Mary never again felt entirely safe. Her father's affection could warm or vanish in a heartbeat, and fury lay close beneath his smiles. As she passed into adulthood, one truth solidified. Her future would depend not on her birth alone, but on her ability to outlast the shifting tempests of English politics. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary Tudor was 31. By Tudor standards, that pushed her toward the edge of permanent spinster. She had endured 6 stepmothers, witnessed England's violent religious swings, survived humiliations and reversals that might have broken a softer spirit. The crown, however, did not pass to her, but to her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI. His council brimmed with radical Protestant advisers who saw Mary's steadfast Catholicism not only as a problem, but as a looming threat. Mary, once again, found herself exposed. Though she was Henry's eldest surviving child and the king's sister, under Edward's regency, she was politically powerless. Her estates were watched. The private massas held in her household were forbidden by law. Servants and visitors were questioned. Spies blended into the fabric of her daily life. The council leaned on her relentlessly to give up Catholic worship. Each demand came edged with danger. Each refusal pulled her closer to treason, yet she would not bend. Her resistance was not mere stubbornness. To Mary, faith was the one fixed point in a world that had stripped away her titles, her security, her mother. The more pressure they applied, the more her resolve crystallized. Her relationship with Edward, he read her steadfastness as disobedience. She felt his insistence as intimate persecution. Their final encounters were charged with sorrow and anger. A boy king fading rapidly, and a sister who could see the chaos waiting beyond his last breath. When Edward died in 1553, the fragile order shattered. The Duke of Northumberland, desperate to keep Protestant control, orchestrated a daring move. He placed Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, upon the throne. It was a gamble built on the hope that Mary was too isolated, too disliked, or too afraid to answer. But Mary Tudor had not survived Henry's court, exile, and spiritual siege, simply to vanish now. She fled. She rode into the countryside. She called for support. And England answered. Within days, she gathered more followers than Northumberland could muster. Even Protestants rallied to her. Not for religion's sake, but for something more fundamental. Legitimacy? Mary was Henry VIII's lawful heir. After years of turbulence, that simple fact carried weight. Her march toward London swelled into a movement. Every village she passed through, every banner raised in her name, declared that the true Tudor line would not be quietly replaced. Jane Grey's fragile reign lasted 9 days. Mary entered London not only as a victorious claimant, but as a woman shaped by loss and betrayal. Behind the cheers and ringing bells, she felt the uncertainty pressing in. She had no husband, no children, no firm promise that the fragile acceptance she had won would hold. Becoming queen was not the final victory she might have once imagined. It was the threshold of her hardest trial. Mary Tudor's accession in 1553 was as close to miraculous as Tudor politics allowed. A woman once dismissed, diminished, and sidelined now rode through streets thick with celebration. Bells pealed, bonfires cast trembling light on smiling faces. For a brief golden span it seemed as if the kingdom truly stood behind her. After years of being humiliated and carefully kept at the edges of power, Mary reached the place she had always believed was hers by divine right. The coronation robes rested on shoulders that had carried long sorrow. But a crown could not erase old fears, nor untangle decades of division, nor guarantee the loyalty of hearts. Her first and greatest challenge lay where she had always expected it. In religion. Mary intended not a quiet adjustment, but a full return to Catholicism. In her mind, this was not politics. It was sacred duty. She believed God had preserved her through disgrace, danger, and loneliness for this precise mission. Her mother's steadfast faith, her own years of being forced to deny what she believed, the brokenness of a youth, all of it fed a narrative in which she was the instrument of restoration. That certainty was her strength. It was also her rigidity. Where others saw doctrinal debates and council arguments, Mary saw a moral emergency. England must return to Rome, and she would be the hand guiding it back. Even before she could fully address doctrine, another urgency loomed over her. Succession. Mary was 37, unmarried. Without an heir, everyone around her understood the peril in this. If she died without a child, the line of inheritance would lead directly to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. In that instant, all Mary's restoration efforts would be swept away. Her council felt this dread keenly. Without a Catholic heir, the realm's religious future would hinge on a woman whose beliefs pointed in a different direction. To Mary, the answer appeared clear. She must marry swiftly and wisely. But whom she should choose fractured opinion from courtly chambers to crowded taverns. Many urged a match with an English nobleman, someone who would ease fears of foreign dominance and keep power anchored on familiar soil. Mary, though, carried Spain in her veins through Catherine of Aragon. Her piety, her reverence for Catholic unity, and her political sense drew her gaze outward to a strong Catholic prince whose presence could shield her reforms and secure her throne. Philip of Spain emerged as the answer, son of Emperor Charles V, a Habsburg prince. With bloodlines that stretched across Europe, to Mary he offered legitimacy, alliance, and the longed-for hope. A child, a family, a future beyond herself. Where Mary saw stability and shared faith, many of her subjects saw shadow. Rumors spread quickly. Philip was not just a foreigner. He was the heir to a vast Spanish empire, and a dynasty known for its reach and power. To ordinary English people, the implications seemed stark. Spanish courtiers in their streets, English taxes funding distant wars, their kingdom pulled into continental conflicts they neither chose nor understood. Even some nobles loyal to Mary, they feared that by marrying Philip, England might become an echo of Spanish interests secondary, its independence thinned. Their anxiety was not entirely unfounded. Yet Mary would not turn. She trusted Philip, trusted Spain, trusted the idea that a powerful Catholic union could protect what she was trying to rebuild. The more resistance she met, the more firmly she gripped the plan. This was more than politics or comfort. It was about securing the Tudor line, vindicating her mother's memory, and anchoring Catholicism for the generations to come. But the kingdom saw something else. By early 1554, the unease burst into open revolt. Sir Thomas Wyatt led an uprising aimed at halting the Spanish marriage, and, in some circles, at removing Mary in favor of Elizabeth. It was a desperate attempt to redirect the future while there was still time. The rebellion failed, yet it shook Mary deeply. She had expected objections in council chambers. She had not fully braced herself for armed men marching toward her capital with the intent of shaping or ending her rule. In response, Mary revealed a steel that history would remember. She addressed the Londoners with a calm fierceness, declaring that she would die a queen rather than surrender her rightful place. The speech echoed through Tudor memory as one of the most striking moments of her reign. Even those who opposed her religion could not easily dismiss her courage. Still, Wyatt's rebellion left its marks. Trust, already fragile, eroded further. Elizabeth fell under deep suspicion, watched closely for signs of complicity, and Mary confronted a painful revelation. Many of her own people did not share her conviction that this marriage would save their souls or their kingdom. Despite this, she did not turn back. In July 1554, Philip arrived in England. Mary walked down the path toward him, toward alliance, toward what she believed would be the healing of old fractures, and the birth of a new generation. She stepped into that future with hope in her heart, not yet knowing that instead of delivering the security she craved, it would draw her deeper into loneliness, misunderstanding, and sorrow. When Philip of Spain finally arrived in England in July 1554, Mary Tudor was brimming with anxious hope. She had imagined a partnership grounded in shared faith, mutual respect, and perhaps, if God allowed it, a tender affection that might bring forth an heir. After years of cold corridors, political sidelining, and the ache of emotional neglect, Mary longed for a companion as much as she needed a successor. She stepped into the marriage with complete sincerity. In her mind, Philip would be both a loving husband and a steadfast ally, a man who understood her devotion and her burdens. Philip, however, saw the union through a very different lens. At 27, 11 years younger than Mary, he had already been married and widowed. Raised in the intensely calculating atmosphere of the Habsburg court, he had been trained to view marriage as strategy. Alliances, borders, dynasties, these mattered. Romance did not. For him, the wedding was a duty to be fulfilled rather than a joy to be embraced. Contemporary witnesses describe Philip as courteous and respectful, but distant. His letters to his father, Emperor Charles Joubert, spoke of obligation, not attachment. He assessed the match as a political arrangement, an alliance to be handled, not a love story to be lived. Mary, longing to be loved, misread his reserve. His politeness felt to her like warmth. His formal attentions seemed like budding affection. She was captivated by his bearing, his Catholic devotion, his polished European manner. Somewhere in the guarded exchanges and ceremonial gestures, she fell deeply, perhaps desperately in love. For a woman starved of steady kindness, Philip's very presence must have felt like a long-awaited confirmation that she was worthy of love. Philip, meanwhile, found England cold in more ways than one. The damp climate, the foreign customs, and the constant suspicion wore on him. He could not speak the language. The nobility regarded him with wary eyes. Worse still, he knew Parliament had carefully restricted his authority. He was king in title, but his power was trimmed and bound, lest he bend England too closely toward Spain. Mary gave him her heart. Philip bowed politely to the realm. He fulfilled his public role. He stood beside her at ceremonies, sat with her in council, played the part of king consort with practiced skill. In private, though, he remained formal, restrained, cautious. De more Maria's affection deepened, the more obvious the imbalance became. Her love leaned forward, his presence leaned away. Then, in late 1554, something extraordinary seemed to happen. Mary's monthly bleeding stopped. Her body changed. She felt heaviness, swelling, bouts of nausea, and sensations she interpreted as life stirring within her. Physicians examined her and confirmed what she wanted so badly to hear. The Queen was with child. For Mary, it felt like the fulfillment of every tearful prayer. For Philip, it meant his reluctant marriage might yet be crowned with success. For England, it awakened a mixture of hope and anxiety. The birth of a Catholic heir would lock the kingdom more firmly into Habsburg and Roman orbit. No one realized how cruelly mistaken they were. By the winter of 1554 to 1555, Mary was certain of her condition. Her body bore all the signs midwives had seen in countless pregnancies. Her breasts tender, her belly rounded. Her energy shifted. The court physicians, steeped in the knowledge of their age, confirmed it again. The court exploded with relief and celebration. Europe watched closely. Letters flew announcing the coming child who would secure the Catholic future of England. This was more than a baby. It was a symbol of Mary's vindication, of her mother's legacy restored, of God smiling on her embattled reign. Mary accepted it as divine reward. After losing so much, her mother, her status, her security, this child felt like God's answer. The child who would heal her marriage, anchor her throne, and carry forward the faith she had fought to restore. Her joy was real. Her symptoms were real. The pregnancy was not. Today, many historians believe Mary suffered from pseudocyesis, phantom pregnancy. It is a condition in which the body mirrors pregnancy so faithfully that even close observers are deceived. It is often connected to intense longing, trauma, and profound psychological strain. Mary's life was full of all three. Her body responded to her heart's desperate desire. Her hormones shifted. Her shape altered. Every sign pointed toward a child who did not exist. Yet the kingdom prepared as if the nursery would soon be filled. Rooms were readied. A cradle was crafted. Gifts were gathered. Letters announcing the birth were drafted ahead of time, ready to be dispatched across Christendom. Parliament even debated what would happen should Mary die in childbirth, including whether Philip might become regent. Philip's manner softened in these months. not because he suddenly fell romantically in love, but because success now seemed within reach. If Mary delivered an heir, the marriage he had entered so coolly would have achieved its purpose. He stayed by her side more faithfully than before, offering a gentler support than his earlier detachment suggested possible. By the spring of 1555, Mary withdrew into seclusion. It was the customary confinement for a queen nearing the time of labor. The court held its breath. Europe gazed toward England. Mary waited, day after day, for the first pains. They did not come. Summer arrived. Still, no child. The silence in her chambers grew heavy. In the shadows of galleries and courtyards, whispers began to spread. Had the queen been mistaken? Was this some judgment from God? Was the child deformed, dying, or already dead? Was there a secret tragedy behind closed doors? Mary clung to hope long after many around her harbored doubts. She remained in confinement, praying, watching, listening to her own body with increasing desperation. Slowly, inexorably, reality seeped in. The movement she thought she felt did not return. The expected pains never began. The swelling, at last, began to... There was no child. Physicians searched for explanations. Courtiers avoided her eyes. The jubilation turned to uneasy silence. For Mary, the loss was not simply the absence of a baby. It was the death of a promise she believed God Himself had made to her. She felt exposed, as if her innermost hopes had been placed on a public stage and then shattered. Humiliation mingled with grief. Her own body, which had seemed to finally cooperate with her prayers, had betrayed her. The future of England's faith, the stability of her marriage, the dream of holding her own living child, slipped away at once. Philip, his interest bound tightly to politics, drifted again. Summoned by affairs on the continent, he left England, returning only when necessity forced him. The marriage, fragile from the start, weakened further. Mary's health, too, began to fray. And in the midst of this physical and emotional decline, another twist awaited her. In 1557, Mary became convinced once more that she was pregnant. The signs, or what she took for signs, returned. Against the backdrop of her first phantom pregnancy, even her closest attendants met this new certainty with quiet skepticism. Yet Mary, older now and bearing the weight of disappointment, could not let go of the possibility. Hope, even fragile and familiar, is hard to refuse. This time, everything around her felt heavier. Her body was more fragile, her spirit more worn. Philip spent most of his time away, swallowed by Spanish and imperial politics. When he did return, it was briefly for treaties and campaigns. Not for her. Mary mistook his political distance for personal indifference. Each delayed visit, each polite excuse, cut deeper. For someone who had always longed for enduring love, his absences spoke loudly. Beyond the palace walls, England suffered under the harsh edge of her religious policies. The burning of Protestant men and women who refused to recant cast long, terrible shadows. Mary believed with all her heart that she was protecting souls from eternal loss. To her, enforcing religious unity was not cruelty, but a painful necessity. Her subjects saw only the flames. In TR eyes, she became something dark, a queen whose faith demanded blood. Where she saw salvation, Ta Salfir, the label Bloody Mary, given later, grew out of those fearful memories, simplifying a complex, wounded woman into a single, terrible image. Her second phantom pregnancy unfolded along the same sorrowful path. Symptoms, hope, preparations, and then nothing. But time the illusion hid something more sinister. The signs of pregnancy may have masked the presence of a serious illness. Modern scholars suggest conditions like ovarian cysts or uterine cancer, though the exact cause is uncertain. Whatever the disease, it drained her quickly. In these final years, Mary's world contracted, political allies thinned, friends died or distanced themselves. Her ambitions met defeat after defeat. One loss haunted Mary more than any other: Calais, England's last foothold in France, which fell in 1558. This was a blow that cut deeper than most. It was like losing a piece of her heart. Legend has it, she once said, "When I die, you will find Calais engraved upon my heart." Whether or not those were her exact words, they perfectly captured the deep sorrow of a queen watching her achievements slip away like sand through her fingers. By late 1558, Mary was confined to her bed, feverish and in pain, fully aware that her life was winding down. It must have been a heavy choice when she named Elizabeth as her successor. I mean, imagine knowing that the sister who would follow you was all in for the very changes you had fought so hard to reverse. Everything she had worked to restore the Mass, her mother's legacy, her vision for England, was about to be dismantled. It's heartbreaking, really. Mary passed away on November 17, 1558, at Houst, 42 years old, alone in so many ways. She was without the husband she had loved more than he ever loved her, without the child she had dreamed of cradling in her arms, and without the lasting religious settlement she had prayed for. History would boil her down to Bloody Mary, a name that really hides the complex human beneath the crown. A frightened, devout, deeply scarred woman. Her childhood was filled with conditional love, her youth marked by humiliation, and her adulthood haunted by unfulfilled longings for affection, for security, for motherhood. It's tough to think about how these experiences shaped her actions, isn't it? Her story doesn't excuse her cruelties, but it does reveal where they came from. Trauma, deep conviction, and a desperate attempt to force a broken world into a shape she believed was required by God. Now, let's flip the script a bit and travel to another time and place. By 324 BCE, Alexander the Great was standing at the peak of his power, ruling over an empire so vast that even his own generals were left scratching their heads, trying to grasp its full span. From the rugged hills of Macedon to the far plains of India, he marched like a storm toppling kings, storming citadels and breaking armies that once seemed invincible to the Greeks. His victories were already drifting into legend. And his charisma, it was magnetic. It captured the loyalty of hardened soldiers and ambitious nobles alike. This guy's ambitions seemed to recognize no horizon, and you can't help but wonder, what drove him to such heights? Was it just power? Or was there something deeper at play? Yet for all the vast lands Alexander commanded, he understood a deeper fragility. His empire was held by the thread of conquest, not the bonds of loyalty. Without true unity, the seams would fray and pull apart. The true challenge was not maps or supply lines. It was the human heart. Macedonians and Greeks carried the quiet pride of victors, seeing Persians and Eastern peoples as subjects to be ruled, not brothers to embrace. Persians, in turn, nursed resentment against the heavy Macedonian Buthanu king's boldness, the uprooting of ancient ways. Even within Alexander's own ranks, murmurs rose like distant thunder. Veterans who had bled through endless campaigns chafed at Persian customs creeping into court life. They watched their king Dan the flowing robes of the East, and whispered that he was drifting from the rugged virtues of their forefathers, seduced by Eastern splendor. Alexander saw farther. His vision stretched beyond Macedonian glory to something grander. An empire where East met West, not in clash, but in quiet fusion. Cultures would mingle like rivers into sea. Old grudges soften into shared purpose. It was a dream born of idealism, yet rooted in the possibility. Least through his unyielding eyes. Unity, he believed, could be shaped like clay, not merely wished upon the wind. If old customs of force and tradition fell short, he would forge new paths. This drive was no idle philosophy. Alexander was a master of the visible act, the gesture that lingered in memory. Kingship, in his world, was theater as much as command of performance. To stir the soul, two with Persians and Macedonians into one fabric, he needed a moment of profound symbolism, something that eyes and hearts could not forget. That vision crystallized as he returned to the heart of Persia, entering the opulent city of Susa. There, in its marble embrace, he would stage an event without precedent. A grand mass wedding, not one union, but Scorzi's Macedonian officers bound to Persian nobility in a single, sweeping rite. Court and culture, blood and dynasty, fused in spectacle. It would echo through time as the wedding of Susa, a stroke of genius cloaked in gold, perfume, music, and the fragile veil of harmony. Beneath the radiance, though, the empire's quiet fault lines waited, patient as stone. Susa was no common crossroads. Once the radiant capital of the Achaemenid Persian realm. It had long been a meeting of worlds. Elamite, Persian, Babylonian threads woven into its very stones. By Alexander's arrival, it stood as a vault of imperial echoes, columns of polished marble, floors inlaid with gold, gardens heavy with bloom, chambers brimming with treasures from forgotten reigns. If he sought to proclaim Persia and Macedon as one, Susa offered the perfect canvas. Its palaces still breathed the might of Darius and Xerxes, kings whose shadows had once darkened Greece. By choosing this stage, Alexander did not merely borrow Persian splendor, acclaimed it, folding it into his dream. Of wholeness, months of preparation unfolded like a gathering dawn. Caravans wound in from distant horizons, laden with silks that caught the light like water, embroidered robes heavy with jewels, vials of rare perfumes, spices that warmed the air, metals gleaming soft as moonlight. Craftsmen converged to raise platforms of fragrant cedar, drape halls in cascading silk, orchestrate a rite rivaling any coronation. To Persians, it whispered Restorationa, nod to lost pride. To Macedonians, it stirred both awe and unease. They had warred against these very halls, spilled blood on these sands. Now, they were asked to wed into the families of their foes. Yet Alexander's presence, his voice, his gaze, his unshakable will carried the day. This was no mere revelry. It was diplomacy in motion, propaganda veiled in joy, culture reshaped by decree. By linking his officers to Persian brides, he wove their futures to the East's stability. A new elite would rise, loyal first to him. Beneath the silk shimmer, though, shadows lingered. Macedonian voices grumbled of being bartered like tools. Persians pondered if this was true partnership or conquest sweetened with ceremony. Susa gleamed, a jewel in the dusk. Yet under its marble calm, the ambitions of two worlds hummed, taut as a boat. At the heart of the Susa rite lay not splendor alone, but the souls chosen to bind it. Alexander selected each pair with care, every match a thread in his grand weave. His finest officers, companions who had shared desert thirst, Montine cold the roar of battle were, joined to Persian noblewomen, daughters or kin of the Achaemenid line he had humbled. It was theater profound and deliberate. Old Persia and New Macedon linked not by ink or iron, but by vows and blood. Alexander himself stood at the center. He already held Roxana of Bactria as wife, a union from years past. Now, in Susa, he took two more, Statera too, daughter of the fallen Darius III, and Perizatis, kin to an earlier king, Artaxerxes III. These bonds were no whim, wed to both recent and ancient Persian royalty. He cloaked himself in legitimacy. No longer mere conqueror, he became heir to the throne he had claimed. For his officers, the path was thornier. Some embraced it. A noble bride meant status, alliances, dowries rich as rivers. Others felt the weight of chain. Soldiers by trade, not statesmen. Many had wives waiting in Macedon. Alexander decreed these rites supreme, yet homecomings loomed shadowed by anger. The Persian women moved between worlds. Raised amid the fall of their houses, they now stepped into the conqueror's design. For some, marriage promised shelter. For others, gilded captivity. They knew the balance. Their presence here was Persia's offering trust or surrender. In all, some 80 Macedonian officers met Persian brides. The scale hushed the air. No Greek sovereign had dared such breath. It transcended strategy. It remade society on imperial breath, yet tension coiled beneath. Macedonians murmured of fading heritage, Persians of subtle subjugation. Each couple stood as emblem, unity's tender shoot, or fracture's hidden seed. When the wedding of Susa at last unfolded, its splendor stilled, even though steeped in Persian rite. Alexander had crafted it to overwhelm, to flood the senses until division drowned in awe. The palace swelled into a realm of light and whisper. Tapestries cascaded from glazed pillars like frozen waterfalls. Braziers breathed incense in veils of myrrh and sandalwood. Gold caught torch flame, scattering stars across stone. Susa had known royal pomp for ages, but this rite breathed anew. The banquet hall alone wove legend. Vast carpets in crimson and sapphire unfurled like fields at dawn. Couches of gold and silver cradled the throng. Musicians wove Greek lyre with Persian pipe, a melody mirroring his vision elegant, entwined. Perfumes mingled with roast lamb's savor, honeyed pastries sigh. The air grew thick, a balm to soothe old scars. Guests arrayed with purpose, Persian lords beside Macedonian captains, voices from empire's edge. Greek and Persian shared cushion, cup, glanced seated as equals in this new dawn. No chance governed the order. Even the vessels spoke. Goblets chased in silver, etched with twin emblems of East and West, raised in toasts that blurred the line between victor and vanquished. Each guest drank from cups of the same shape and metal, a quiet, gleaming signal that in Alexander's empire, status would not rest solely on old bloodlines. At least, that was the message she wanted the hall to feel. Then the brides began their slow procession. They entered in waves of color and light, wrapped in rich Persian garments embroidered with gold thread, veils soft as mist, adorned with jewels once worn at the Achaemenid court. At the forefront walked Alexander's two new queens, Statera and Perisates, with Mesured, composed grace. Behind them came the 80 Persian noblewomen chosen for his officers, a living river of silk and lineage. The moment was layered with emotion and calculation. Macedonian soldiers watched, some with awe at the splendor, others with unease at what it all meant. Persian nobles observed with careful eyes, weighing gain against loss, honor against submission. When Alexander rose to speak, the music stilled. The murmurs faded. He did not address them as a Macedonian warlord, but as the ruler of a single, woven world. He praised concord between peoples, hailed this ceremony as the beginning of a new age where Greek and Persian no longer stood opposed. His words reached for the stars idealistic, perhaps even naive, yet under that forest of torches, amid gold and color. For a brief time it seemed possible that such unity could be real. The celebration stretched over days. Wine ran freely. Dancers moved in circles of shadow and flame. Poets recited verses in different tongues, each line a bridge between courts. Gifts poured upon the coupleslans, jewels, fine garments. The whole affair felt designed to melt away old boundaries in a tide of joy. But when the last song faded and the torches dimmed, the true trial of Alexander's design had only just begun. For all its beauty, the Wedding of Susa was never truly about romance. It was about control. Alexander understood that marriage could bind more tightly than chains. By joining his Macedonian commanders to Persian noble women, he tried to forge a new aristocracy whose loyalty would lie not with one people, but with the empire itself and, above all, with him. If these unions bore children, so much the better. Those sons and daughters would stand as living symbols of the world he imagined, neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something new and intertwined. As propaganda, the plan was dazzling. Alexander cast himself not as an outsider occupying Persia, but as its rightful successor. By taking daughters of Darius and Artaxerxes as his own wives, he laid claim to their thrones through marriage, as well as conquest. To Persian nobles, this was both a compliment and a disarming move. To Macedonians, it felt deeply strange. They saw their king wearing Persian robes, observing Persian ceremonies, bowing to Persian forms of address. Was this the blending of cultures, or their surrender? The mass weddings also had a quieter edge of discipline. After years on campaign, the army had grown restless, feeling slighted as Persians rose to high posts in administration. Grumbling about favoritism and exhaustion grew louder. Alexander's answer was to anchor his officers to the east. A man with a Persian wife, a home, and estates in the provinces would think twice before plotting revolt or dreaming of a quiet life back in Macedon. He would be invested in the empire's eastern half, not just by duty, but by family. Still, irritations simmered beneath the polished surface. Many officers felt they had little choice in accepting their brides. Some had wives and children waiting far away. Others distrusted Persian customs. They sensed themselves being maneuvered on a board whose full pattern only Alexander saw. Persian houses, too, were divided. For some, these marriages restored a measure of status under new rule. For others, they were an indelible sign of defeat. Their daughters presented as tokens in a game they had not chosen to play. Reconciliation, to them, felt indistinguishable from dressed-up submission. Alexander, convinced of his own vision, pressed forward. He believed unity could be crafted the way one shapes a city, with plans, with ceremonies, with will. The Wedding of Susa stood in his mind as a masterpiece of imperial design. But no matter how carefully drawn, dreams of harmony must still cross the rough ground of human feeling. And here, the fractures began to show. The mass wedding was intended as the shining centerpiece of Alexander's policy of fusion, his attempt to blend Macedonian and Persian worlds into one shared empire. Yet as the guests drifted back to their obligations and camps, the distance between plan and reality became painfully clear. For Alexander, this was the latest step in a long journey. He had already adopted aspects of Persian court ritual, welcomed Persians into his administration, elevated Eastern soldiers into trusted positions. He did not want to be merely a Macedonian king ruling a foreign land. He wanted to preside over a new civilization, born from the mingling of many peoples. The weddings, to him, were not a flourish, but a foundation. Through them, he imagined a generation for whom Greek or Persian were secondary to a single imperial identity. Allegiance to him, rather than ancestry, would define belonging. But centuries of contempt could not be brushed aside like dust from a cloak. Macedonians had grown up on stories of Persian arrogance and defeat. The opulent, soft-spoken enemy humbled at Marathon and Plataea. Persians had their own tales, seeing Macedonians as hardy, yes, but rough. Provincial warriors from the mountains, one night of vows and banquets, could not dissolve all those deep-seated views. Too many, the unity Alexander sought, felt like two strangers forced to clasp hands before a watching crowd. In the months that followed, discontent in the ranks shifted from confusion into anger. Alexander's men began to feel that the man they had followed across continents was slipping from their grasp. The king who once shared their hardships now appeared robed in Eastern finery, speaking of distant ideals. They muttered that he favored Persians, that he loved Asia more than the land that had given him birth. Comparisons surfaced in their quiet conversations. Not to Achilles, the heroic Greek warrior he admired, but to Xerxes, the Persian great king, once seen as the embodiment of excess and overreach. Officers, too, wrestled with their new roles. Some had come to understand their families in Susa and beyond, but many remained uneasy. They had pledged themselves to Alexander as soldiers, not as instruments of social change. They had conquered Persia. They had never asked to become half Persian themselves. On the Persian side, the picture was no less tangled. A noble house might gain influence through a Macedonian son-in-law, but power in the empire still flowed from Macedonian hands. The army, the crown, the ultimate decisions all lay beyond Persian control. To many, the unions looked less like mutual blending and more like a slow, graceful swallowing. Even long-standing companions began to question Alexander's path. They still saw his brilliance, but now they also saw a growing distance. The man of the march, approachable and fierce, seemed to be receding behind a curtain of ceremony and vision. Alexander, undeterred, kept pushing toward his imagined unity. Yet the truth remained: harmony could not be ordered into existence, and genuine loyalty could not be mass-produced through arranged unions. The empire might have looked unified for an evening in Susa's torchlight, but under the surface, the old divisions held. When the music at Susa fell silent and the last of the radiant cups were gathered away, Alexander's army was left with more questions than answers. What he saw as a beautiful symbol of the future, many of his Macedonian followers experienced as evidence that their world was slipping from them. The officers who had shared his earliest victories now felt something breaking between themselves and the king. The weddings had not truly blended Greek and Persian lives. They had thrown into sharp relief how far apart those lives still stood. Among the ordinary soldiers, frustration hardened. These were men who had marched with him from the first battles in Greece, across the rivers at Granicus and Issus, through the siege of Tyre, into the depths of Asia. They had suffered thirst, wounds, and exhaustion, held together by their pride and their devotion to Alexander as their own. Now they watched him adopt the trappings of a Persian ruler, surround himself with Persian advisors, and insist on honoring customs they barely understood. The Wedding of Susa became, in their minds, the clearest sign yet that he was changing into something unfamiliar. Some began to say that Alexander had not conquered Asia so much as Asia had conquered him. Its clothes on his shoulders, its titles in his mouth, its style shapen his chord. The strain reached its breaking point at AOPS in 324 BCE, only months after the weddings. When Alexander announced that he intended to send older Macedonian veterans home with rewards and replace them in his ranks with Persian troops, fury erupted. To Alexander, this may have seemed a rational step, honoring weary soldiers with retirement, drawing in fresh forces from the east. To many of those soldiers, it felt like dismissal and replacement. They saw themselves being gently pushed aside in favor of the very people they had once fought. Anger boiled over. Voices that had once shouted his name in battle now shouted accusations. They cried out that he no longer belonged to them, that he had become the king of the Persians, not of Macedon. In that moment, the rift laid bare at Susa could no longer be hidden beneath gold and music. The unity Alexander had tried so dramatically to stage had not taken root in the hearts that mattered most. For Alexander, who believed deeply in his own mission, the mutiny at Apis felt less like mere disobedience and more like a personal wound. He had imagined himself as the architect of a new world, only to hear his own veterans call him stranger and foreign king. He answered first with fury. He ordered the ringleaders seized, punished, and executed. He rebuked his men for their ingratitude, reminding them of the battles they had fought, the treasures they had shared, the glory they had won together. His words cut, accusing them of betrayal after all he had given them. But anger softened into something else. In a near-theatrical reversal, he shifted from rage to reconciliation. Before the assembled troops, Alexander wept openly. He embraced soldiers who stepped forward. He spoke of their shared journey, their wounds, their victories, and then he did something entirely in character for the man who staged weddings as policy. He created a new symbol. He proclaimed a kind of formal union between Macedonians and Persians, sometimes remembered as a brotherhood of man. He invited leaders of both peoples to stand side by side, as if to declare that, from this point on, they were not conquerors and conquered, but comrades under one sun. It was a moving scene, sincere, poignant, and at the same time precarious. A moment where emotion and vision briefly aligned. Yet behind the speeches and embraces lay a harder truth. Alexander longed for unity more deeply than his empire did. The Wedding of Susa had not mended ancient divisions. It had exposed them, showing just how far his dreams stood from the feelings of those he ruled. And the greatest test of that dream was still approaching. In the months after the Susa ceremony, Alexander did not retreat. He pushed his program of fusion more intensely. In his mind's eye, he could already see the future children of these marriages, growing into a class of leaders who would not think first of Macedon or Persia, but of the greater empire and of him. They would be the living proof of a blended world, their bloodlines crossing borders that had once divided continents. But fate had a way of turning his grand designs into quiet unravelings. The first cracks appeared not in battle, but in households. Many Macedonian officers treated their Persian wives as burdens, not partners. Some ignored them almost entirely, cold and distant. Others treated the marriages as a temporary requirement and continued to live as though unbound. Persian families who had hoped these unions would lead to genuine respect and partnership began to see the reality. Politeness without warmth, obligation instead of affection. Where Alexander hoped for unity, resentment and disappointment began to grow. His experiment in enforced kinship was faltering long before the empire itself began to break. The final rupture came swiftly and brutally with Alexander's own death in Babylon in 323 BCE. Scarcely a year after the celebrations at Susa, he was only 32. His sudden absence left a vast vacuum. The empire he had hammered together now trembled without the one person who believed fully in its shared identity. The ideals he had wrapped around Susa were left in the hands of men who had never truly shared his vision. One of the earliest acts of his successors cut directly at the heart of that vision. Freed from Alexander's presence and pressure, many Macedonian generals wasted no time. They dissolved the Susa marriages. Some did so quietly through formal dismissal. Others cast their wives aside with overt contempt. The carefully constructed web of unions, meant to last generations, vanished with startling speed. All around 80 marriages fell apart like dawn mist. The message could not have been clearer. Whatever Alexander had dreamed of this splendid elite, this shared future had died alongside him. The Persian brides, money from high-born familias, found themselves discarded. Some returned to their kin in shame. Others found no clear place in the fracturing political order. They had once stood as symbols of unity. Now they were reminders of a failed experiment. Alexander's own Persian queens, Statera and Parysotis, suffered an even crueler fate. As rival factions scrambled for dominance, Roxana, his first wife from Bactria and the mother of his posthumous son, moved to secure her position. In the ruthless logic of succession politics, the presence of other royal widows was a threat. Both Persian queens were killed, likely at Roxana's direction. A ceremony that had once been draped in gold and hopeful words ended in blood and silenced voices. Wetin Ayer, the mass wedding that had dazzled Susa, stood revealed as a fragile facade. It had never truly anchored his empire. Instead, it now marked how quickly his most idealistic policies could be undone. His officers wanted land, titles, and autonomy, not a fused identity. His generals wanted thrones of their own, carved from his territories, not to uphold a shared imperial dream. Alexander's vision of a blended world shattered as easily as the vows he had arranged. Susa, which had once glowed as the center of imperial celebration, became in hindsight a monument to an idea the ancient world was not ready to accept. At a distance, the Wedding of Susa might look like a glittering aside in Alexander's Talon, extravagant evening in a life filled with victories and sieges, but its meaning runs deeper than the music and jeweled robes. It was the highest expression of his most daring political idea, that conquest could give way to cooperation, that empire could be stabilized not only by fear and might, but by shared families and shared futures. It also stands as the sharpest reminder of the limits of his power. He could cross mountains and rivers with armies, break the walls of fortified cities, and humble kings, but he could not simply command people to feel like one people. Later, historians looked back on Susa with divided judgment. Some praised it as proof of his originality and attempt to transform empire from occupation into partnership. Others saw it as the point where his policy drifted too far from the world around him, where his imagination outran what his followers could accept. His Macedonian soldiers, who had once idolized him as their heroic leader, watched him grow closer to Persian ways, and felt that he was leaving them behind. Persian nobles, though honored, recognized that real power still lay in Macedonian hands, and his officers, asked to sacrifice personal desires for an experiment in identity, quietly turned away as soon as they could. The marriages failed, yet the idea beneath them, in a quieter form, survived. Alexander had tried to fuse cultures overnight through ceremony. The world, instead, changed more slowly. The Greek language spread into cities far from Macedon. Philosophies traveled along trade routes. Local customs absorbed and reshaped Greek thought. The cities he founded, especially Alexandria in Egypt, became centers where many peoples lived side by side, trading stories, goods, and beliefs. The fusion he sought did not come from wedding contracts drafted in a single city. It came through decades of contact, migration, and the ordinary mingling of lives. The Wedding of Susa remains a mirror for Alexander himself. Brilliant, extravagant, courageous, and ultimately fragile. It highlights the power of his imagination and the stubbornness of the world he tried to transform. He could redraw borders with his armies. He could topple dynasties with strategy, but he could not compel hearts to forget old divisions with a single Rhodian ceremony. In the end, Susa stands as a quiet lesson. Even the boldest vision needs more than spectacle and decree. It needs time, acceptance, and a world willing to change. In 324 BCE, under the torchlight and music, Alexander believed that world had already arrived. It had not. At 7 years old, in another part of the ancient world, a Spartan boy reached a very different turning point. One day, he belonged to his mother's arms, his father's house, his family's rituals. The next, he belonged to the state. He was taken from home and delivered into the Aegae, the state-run system that would shape him, harden him, and in many ways erase the child he had been. This was not a gentle schooling. It was a cutting away. The boy's tears, his mother's desperate grief, his father's proud silence, none of it mattered against Sparta's. In this society, sentiment bowed before necessity. Sparta had no room for softness, no patience for private attachments, no interest in what we might call childhood. The boy was no longer a son to his parents. It was a tool placed in the forge. His new life began in a communal barracks, surrounded by other boys of his age. Strangers, at first. Later, something like brothers, not because of tenderness, but because of shared ordeal. There were no feathered beds, only piles of reeds. The boys themselves had to collect and tear apart with their hands. They slept on these rough mats, curled under thin cloaks, shivering through the cold nights. Can you imagine that discomfort? It was no accident, though. Every little detail of their existence was designed to teach them how to endure, to toughen them up. A Spartan boy quickly learned that warmth, comfort, and a mother's embrace were part of a world he had left behind. It was a harsh reality check, right? Food. Oh man. It was rationed with a cruelty that was disguised as purpose. Portions were deliberately meager, just enough to keep them going, but not enough to satisfy. Hunger became a constant companion, that dull ache in their stomachs training their minds as much as their bodies. This was all part of the Aggie, the rigorous training program that aimed to produce boys who could think quickly, mob silently, and survive on almost nothing. Stealing wasn't outright forbidden. It was more about how you went about it. Getting caught was the real crime. The instructors expected these boys to sneak extra food, to be clever, to take risks. A boy who managed to steal successfully, he was praised for his cleverness and resourcefulness. But if he got caught, well, he'd face the lash not for the theft itself, but for his lack of skill. Can you believe that? It's like they were teaching them that failure was the worst sin of all. Overseeing this brutal world were the Padanamoi, the boy herders. These guys ruled without an ounce of softness. They weren't teachers in any gentle sense. They didn't encourage or soothe. Their job was to carve away fear and hesitation, turning boys into men who could face anything. They demanded that the boys stand tall in the face of pain without flinching, accept humiliation without losing their cool, and confront hardship without a single complaint. Crying, that would just invite mockery. But if you could endure with a straight face, that earned you respect. A boy's worth was measured by how little of his inner life he revealed. Yet, even within this harsh and punishing system, something beautiful emerged. The boys had been stripped of family comfort, leaving them with only each other. In their shared hunger, shared beatings, and shared cold, they formed a bond deeper than mere acquaintance. This was the hidden core of the Aggie. A brotherhood forged not from kindness, but from the understanding that no one else would truly get what they had gone through. Cut off from everything but Sparta and each other, they learned to love the state because it was the only constant left in their lives. But underneath all this structured cruelty lay preparation for something even darker. The removal from home was just the first step. Whispers in the barracks, half laughing and half fearful, hinted at the trials yet to come. Once a boy had endured the shock of separation, the next phase of the Aggie began. This phase aimed not just to harden his body, but to completely remake his mind and instincts, what we think of as childhood. You know, curiosity, play, exploration without fear found little room here. Each day revolved around tests. Tests of strength, tests of silence, tests of obedience, and tests of emotional control. The line between education and ritualized cruelty blurred, then disappeared altogether. Step B. Step the boy was shaped into something Sparta valued above all else, a weapon that could think, march, and keel on command without hesitation and without looking back. It's chilling to think about. Right, this was a world that took innocence and twisted it into something fierce and unyielding. What do you think about that kind of upbringing? It's a lot to unpack, isn't it? The boys trained barefoot through every season. Even the biting Spartan winters when frost clung to the earth like a shroud. Their souls toughened into calloused leather, able to sprint across jagged rocks, thorny scrub, and sun-scorched ground without a flinch. They ran distances that blurred the horizon, wrestled until blood slicked their skin, sparred with wooden weapons heavy enough to snap bones or shatter resolve. Drills pushed them to the edge of collapse, breath ragged, limbs trembling. When a boy crumpled, no hand reached to lift him. He rose on his own, or faced the slow shame of his instructor's gaze and his peers' turned backs. In Sparta, pain was no signal to halt. It was the quiet affirmation that the work mattered. Hunger shadowed them like a faithful hound, Meals came as thin broth, a crust of bread barely enough to quiet the growl in their bellies. This scarcity was no oversight. It owned them to live lean, to improvise, to move unseen. A boy who slipped into the stores and took what he needed proved his cunning. One who fumbled and was seen earned the whip not for the theft, but for the failure that let him be caught. Layered over the body's trials came the mind's quiet siege. Older boys ruled the younger in a rigid chain, each rank a test of yielding and command. Humiliation wove through daily life, public rebukes that stripped away pride, menial tasks to break the spirit, trials crafted to lay bare any hidden frailty. These were not random cruelties. They taught submission to the unbreakable whole, the endurance of scorn without retort, the burial of self beneath duty. A Spartan needed to heed an order in the instant it fell, to move as one without the drag of ego. Words, too, came under discipline. Boys learned to speak in fragments terse, edged, essential. A loose tongue betrayed a loose mind. From this grew the laconic speech, those carved phrases that echoed through legend, brief as a blade's edge. Silence became their armor, wrapping thoughts and feelings in an unbreakable hush. Yet amid the unyielding press, something vital took shape. Shared trial bound them. They became each other's shield. Scowled, spiriting a glance across a crowded barrack, sensing weakness before it showed, moving as a single shadow. This weave of loyalty would one day turn phalanxes into walls no army could breach. All this, though, was mere groundwork. The Agi held deeper shadows, the hidden rites of stealth, of solitude, of the final edgewaitered in the gathering dark. If one thread ran through Spartan teaching, it lay in this quiet riddle: steal by command, yet only suffer if discovered. No contradiction hid here. It was the forging of Shadow's cunning walkers who claimed what the mission required, unseen and untouched. The Agi-shaped hunters for the night, raiders who pierced lines without ripple, survivors who fed on enemy scraps. So the boys took food from guarded larders, cloaks from drying lines, reeds for their mats, blades dulled for sharpening. Hunger was the spur, rations a deliberate taunt. A sated boy risked complacency. One with empty hands learned hunger's edge. Under moonless skies or in the blind spots of watchful eyes, they glided. Kitchens fell silent under their touch. Farms at the valley's rim yielded cheese, fruit, a stolen fowl. Each step whispered of silence. Weight shifted heel to toe, breath held against the wind's hush. Success rippled through the barracks, like a shared secret nods across the dim. A crust broken in quiet triumph. Failure met the open lash. Ours sometimes, under eyes that judged not the deed, but the flaw. These nights taught more than pilfering. They mapped the world. Shadow's deepest pools, echoes off rough stone, a sentry's habitual pause, the grip of a sill for soundless climb, the melt into brush. Every raid mirrored war's hidden face. Steel arigned without stirring sleep, and one day slit blades into a camp's heart. Punishment sealed the lesson, the rod fell. But shame lingered longer, the gaze of equals who had succeeded where you faltered. Pain, baseth, the burn of inadequacy, sharpened the next hunt. Some tested farther, into Helot lands, where resentment sit. Livestock vanished from shadowed pens, supplies lifted from Helot huts. These runs held teeth. Helots bore no love for Spartan whelps, and a cornered boy faced not whips, but stones, or worse. Yet triumph etched a name. Legends began not in bronze clash, but in the hush of raided fields, the vanish of footsteps on duet earth. Through these years, the Agi turned from raw endurance to honed peril. Boys ceased mere survival. They became predators silent, exacts without tremor, and soon the true measure loomed. Stealing sustained the body. Killing claimed the future. The Agi's shadowed crown was not lash or famine, nor endless march. It was solitude's grip. At a set age, boys parted from the pack, cast into isolation's chill embrace. No map, no voice, no brother at the shoulder, only self against the wild's slow grind a forge to strip reliance, to unearth what lay beneath. This held no calm vigil or sage thought. It was pressure woven near to breaking, crafting lone wolves who needed no pack. A boy entered alone. No rations, no roof, no fires, promise. He sought his fill, his nest, his ward from frost, drawing only on raids and woodcraft, learned in gloom. Nights stretched, cold seeping bone deep, hunger a blade's twist, shadows alive with peril. Wolves padded the fringes. Stray dogs hunted in packs. Helots, nursing old hates, might turn on a lone youth with reapers, hook, or stone. No barriers softened the wild. Sparta chose the raw fringe. Here, instinct ruled over rote. Each snap in brush a snare, each silhouette astray held breath. The boy learned true hearing. Wind's murmur of approach, earth's shift under tread. Night's hush, as herald, stay unseen, or join the dust. Yet solitude cut deeper than fang or frost. Panic marked the child still clinging. Recklessness betrayed the undisciplined. Those who returned carried change. Quieter step, colder gaze, a world's weight etched in silence. Secrecy cloaked these trials. Elders spoke little, committed less, to scroll. Boys held their tales close, each a private scar. Sparta trusted. One who met the void alone would face a host unmoved. Solitude opened the final gate. Stealth preserved, hush concealed. But Sparta's deepest call demanded chillier craft. To end life, not in sunlit phalanx, but night's fold. If early Aggie built the vessel to bear pain and void, what followed filled it with purpose, to slay without pause, without sound, without echo of regret. Spartan war knew more than spear lines locked in bronze. Whispers told of shadows at work. Scouts turned slayers, lone blades in the gloom. Boys trained for this veiled craft to stalk, to close, to vanish. No voice named it plain. Today, death's art. It wove through every drill. Creepwork taught waits ghosts. Twig, uncracked. Leaf, undisturbed. Strikes learned on flesh's map. Throat's soft yield. Kidneys hidden crush. Lungs silent flood. No parchment traced the way. Demonstration breathed it. Beast led to stillness. Helot condemned to lesson. To tender aistera. To Sparta. Polish short Xiphos honed. Needle fine served this rite not hoplites reach, but assassin's whisper slipped to ribs. Sever breath before cry rose. A life spent. Shadow unbroken. Instructors drilled the boys without mercy on swiftness. One hand sealed the mouth in silence. The next drove the blade true. These motions repeated until they lived in the sinew, flowing without thought or pause. Yet technique alone forged no killer. The deeper forge lay in the mind. The Aggies sought youths who could end a life without tremor, without the whisper of doubt. Where other Greeks pondered virtue or the soul's quiet call, Sparta carved away such burdens. Duty filled the void. Obedience drowned all questions. Hesitation, they learned, risked not just the self, but the city's fragile thread. A single falter could unravel the phalanx, invite helot blades into Spartan homes. Night sharpened this edge. Boys slipped into the black two shadow instructors, posed as scouts, hearts steady against the dark. Failure brought the lash's bite. Success earned a nod, so spirit felt like dew on parched stone. Slowly, the act shifted in their eyes. No longer sin or sorrow, but craft. Measure of the hand's true aim. Whispers circled of greater rites. The silent stroke in the cryptia, Sparta's veiled watch. That shadowed path waited ahead. For now, they absorbed the peril's core lesson. A Spartan stood not just strong, but unseen lethal breath, bound utterly to the state's unyielding will. Soon, the Aggie would weigh these skills, not in shadow play, but beneath real night's weight, where breath caught wrong meant the end. Spartan boys learned no reliance on wagons heavy with grain, no trust in crowded camps or cheering kin. A true guardian of Sparta endured anywhere, in any storm, asking nothing, awaiting no hand. The Aggie cast them into the wild alone, or with one shadowed, peer-armed with cloak, knife, and the cunning carved from years. Survival stood not as drill, but decree. Mountains ringed Sparta in jagged silence, stone and thorn under relentless sun or winter's knife. Beasts stirred in ravine and wood. A boy met them not as guest, but as their measure. He learned not mere breath, but mastery. Thrive amid the lean, the freeze, the fang. Nature judged without mercy. Sparta shed no tears for the frail. Tracking came first. Eyes honed to earth's faint script. Mud held tailies. Print step spoke weight. Edges crumble. Age fresh trail gleamed with dew. Stale faded to dust. Prey led them silent through break and stone. No clamor of net or spear, hands alone, or knives. Hush, the land breathed secrets. Birds' sudden wheel betrayed footfall afar. Winds slant traced hidden paths. Clouds' veil promised flood. Shelter rose low from earth and limb, veiled in brush. Unseen from trail or height, comfort yielded to shadow. Fire's glow they warded chilt with layered reed. Body's own warmths coiled tight. Raw sustenance filled the gut when fire denied. Water sought, not carried. Spring's damp moss, grass heavy with dawn. River's dry scar hiding seep. Thirst felled thee, and forage demanded the wild's hidden lore. Roots swelled safe beside poison's twin. Berry sweet masked death's bile. Mistake brought wretcher fever's fire. Sparta chose this winnow. One blind two-bomb, or bane served no line of bronze. Yet the trial cut soul deep. Solitude bared the core. Fear's claw, pride's fool fall. Discipline's steel spine, silence the inner storm, or fall to the outer. These wanderings birthed not men, but shades. Deep in foe lands, unbreaking amid want, keen through peril's haze. No mere spearmen, but blades self-forged, ever ready. Still, wilderness bowed to a sterner shadow. The Cryptia, rite of hush, and iron most veiled, most dreaded. Among the Agias' unyielding forge, none breathed deeper chill than the Cryptia. This shadowed passage sifted the elect. Strongest frame, sharpest guile, obedience without seam. To earn its call was crown unseen. To the world beyond, it lingers as creation's starkest chill. The rite stirred without trumpet. A boy rose to whisper or midnight's tug. Handed cloak and dagger alone, he faded from barrack light, ghost amid the known. None who watched spoke after. None who missed him asked. Months, seasons blurred. He answered only elders' unseen pull. Its heart watched the helots. Toiling throng outnumbering Spartans tenfold, earth's yield in their hands, armies bred from their sweat. Yet Sparta trembled at their massed hate. The Cryptia stood ward. Revolt's spark met blade in dark. Youth's ghosted fields by moonless veil. They hid in cleft or thicket. Villages watched unseen. Whispers weighed for threat. One deemed foe fell. Throat parted hush. Roads bend become grave. No chain held the hand. No law named the mark. Strategic hush terrors weave. Controls quiet thread. More than blade work, it remade the soul. Loan from kin tie forbidden, cure claimed in night's fold. He learned earth's pulse, animal keen, tracked by crushed blade, scent on breeze. Stones shift under tread, violence turned intimate. Not phalanx roar, but solitary reap. Elders trusted. One who reaped alone. Comrade. Absen, battle absent, feared no host. Cryptia breathed utter yield. Utter chill. Some returned stunk-tempered. Others, husks. A few fed earth, entire. Survival opened darker gate. Helots menaced less than self's last chain. Fear's root, to be severed clean. Spartan elders held fear the hidden fracture. One who shrank from night, from void, from death's brush, weakened the line. So came rites, veiled deeper. Mind stripped bare. Spirit bent to steel. Famed among them, the vigil of night and hush. Days, weeks, lone in wilds, grasped no morsel, no spark, no stir beyond breath's rhythm, voice-bound absolute. No song, no murmur toward the black. Dark pressed thought and phantom alike, they demanded burrow. Helotai or beast fang claimed the scene. Night, bad move. Watch, hone, Terrain, graven deep, stepped by feel and echo alone. Fear of unseen dissolved here. Wind spoke step. Hush hid ambush, yet elders wove deeper. Cries afar rent the veil. Brush cracked near camp, silhouettes loom in gloom. No strike fell direct. Peril breathed constant, unbidden. Hold still. Hold silent. Hold whole. Many limped back. Spent, eyes sunken. Frame frayed, yet drawing breath. Fear's thrall saw them cast from right. Masters returned, altered predators glide. Dark's kin, sounds scorn. Fear yielded not to banish, but command. In phalanx lock, they stood stone as shades afield. Vapor. As helots dread. Storm unseen. One gate lingered. Ag's crown. Cryptius seal. Stealth. Lone will. Yield. Fear's chain sundered all. Met in final hunt. Prey this time breathed. Struck back. Sparta's end trial breathed no scroll. No herald's call. Shadowborn. Fragment whispered. Elder not alone. It crowned the forge. State claimed soul. Keel unshaken. Human softness shed. The hunt unfeigned. No watcher loomed. No mock foot. Cloak. Dagger. Wordvig. Clim Sparta's peril. Mark moss. Oft helit. Strong. Rebel sparkel frame. Peril's arm. No weaklings. Cold predator met peer. Trail crossed vale. Wood. Gorge. Year-hound craft. Alone. Habit read. Path foreseen. Strike's breath chosen. Slop meant doom. Hush. Absolute cries summoned horde. Hunter turned quarry. Here parted whelp from warden. Warden from wraith. Triumph met no revel. No crowns gleam. Elder's grave incline. Alone. Threshold crossed. Life reaped not in bronze storm, but chill's lone arc. Sparta trusted. Such hand faltered never in war's tide. Failure sealed, swift. Helots turn, or state's quiet. A race. No half-wrought, blade endured. Survivors, shet boyhoods. Husk, barracks, welcomed, spartiates full. Live state's loom policy. Fray, survival scarred, kin faded. Dread stilled. Self dissolved. Sparta alone. The veiled rites sought no men to cherish. Weapons alone. Unquestioned, unbreaking, honed flawless. In Tatvork, the Aegi wrought its chill triumph.